So now that Steve has completed all of the animation for our talented ball animated short, and he's also placed all of the cameras in the scene, it's time for us to move on to the next element, and that is lighting. So before we get in there and start placing lights throughout our scene, I thought it would be nice if we spent just a minute over on the whiteboard and discussed what lighting we were going to use and why we were going to use this particular setup. Now, when lighting the scene, you can say that there are a set of rules that an artist can follow. Of course, these rules are made to be broken. Now, there is no very specific set of formulas that can be used to derive values that need to be set up into parameters for how a light is going to cast light, color of light, as well as shadows, etc. So we're going to walk our way through this. Just keep in mind this is still the introductory project. We'll get into more complex lighting later, though I think Steve's done an excellent job. One of the things I would like to point out ahead of time is that you're going to find all lights that do not have a very specific color will be left 1, or a value of pure white. And that's very important. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because you can go out to a bookstore and you can pick up a book on 3D animation and you can start working your way through it, and you get into the lighting section, and often you'll find where an author is going to tell you, don't ever leave a light white, because you don't really have pure white lights in the real world. Well, we're doing it for a very specific reason, and that is this scene is being developed in such a way that we're going to be able to break all of our renders down a series of passes that can then be composited back up in Houdini's compositor. When we do that, all of the lights that have been left a pure white, we can then control what that lighting color will be in the post-process time, and that's going to give us a lot of flexibility. So we're leaving a lot of white light left in the scene for a very specific reason. So I wanted to point that out ahead of time in case anyone happens to think to themselves, hey, why are you leaving that light white? Okay, so jumping over to the whiteboard, first thing I'd like to do is spend just a second and draw out our scene. So starting out with something that looks hopefully not too horrible. Ooh, look at that. Fantastic. So there we are with our stage. On the stage, we know that we have a character. He's going to start out somewhere back over here. We have our pool. Our pool sits really close to the front, something like that. Of course, a little bit more centered up. And then we have our diving board that's coming over part of the pool, followed up by a ladder with the 2 spheres on top. So there is a top-down view. We also have our stadium, so our stadium is going to look something like this. Of course, this is going to be just a very crude look. So here, 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 and finally here. And then with this, we can go ahead and start drawing out the different pieces so that you can see the various columns that I have in mind with this quick demonstration. So something like that, that guy, and then finally this guy over here. Okay, so here we are with our scene. What lights are we going to do? Well, first of all, this is an actor that is performing for an audience in what feels like sort of a circus environment. So it would be nice if we had some spotlights, I mean real spotlights, just like in the real world, shining down on him so we'd see an illuminated area around the character so that our audience is being told, look here. And we'll achieve this with our 2 main spotlights that Steve will be creating. So starting out somewhere back up over here. Now these lights are going to be raised really high up in the air. We'll begin with main spot 1. And as we work our way through this whiteboard presentation, I'm going to write these light names down so that you guys can make a mental connection so that when you get over into Houdini and Steve begins slinging lights around, you're going to recognize what light you're dealing with. So having this light point down at the character, once again, he's going to be pretty high up. He'll be higher than the ladder. And the point is we're going to make sure that this main spot and the next main spot that I'm going to draw in just a second will always track our character, even as our character is climbing up the ladder. And that way, extra illumination will be thrown onto the rungs and the side of the ladder as well as the diving board itself. So let me go ahead and throw one more. We're going to offset another light. Again, keep in mind this is going to be pretty high up over here. And this guy is going to be main spot 2.
So these are going to work kind of like in the real-world situation where you'd have a guy standing at a controllable spotlight. He stands in the same place. These lights aren't going to move in terms of position, but he can rotate that light around to track the character, and that's exactly what these 2 lights are going to do.
Precisely. So we're going to end up with a ring of light, something like this, and then overlapping over here something like this. Just a quick idea. So now that we have two key spotlights that are tracking our character as he is running around through the scene, it's time to throw in some extra illumination. Obviously, we don't want our entire stage to be in black. That wouldn't look good. We'd like for our audience members to see the ladder that our character is approaching, as well as the pool up underneath the diving board. And we'll go about this by putting in 3 secondary spotlights. These guys will have specific colors, where our main spotlight 1 and 2 will be left with a color value of white. So for these guys, we'll put something over here. So I'll put a giant circle in this guy so I can throw a color. This guy's going to be blue back over here. This guy's going to be red. And then finally, somewhere back over here, we're going to have this guy being green, shining down in this way. And the whole idea is that we're going to overlap some lights. So we get something like this, and then this light coming from up here, going to provide a bunch of illumination over here. But the interesting thing is, the place where all of the lights are going to end up crossing one another, that's going to pretty much be white because we've used our primary colors here. So keep that in mind. Steve, is there something you'd like to add?
Yes, the bulk of the stage is going to end up with fairly close to white illumination because of the fact that we're going to get the overlapping of all of these circles of light. But where the pool and the ladder are getting hit from different directions by these lights, just due to the positioning of those lights.
Well, you'll have some green light back over here on this side. You're going to have some red light falling back over here on this side. It's going to give a really nice dynamic look to the items that are sitting on top of the stage.
And it's really going to add to that feel of being at the circus. Bright colors, bright lights.
Yeah. So we'll do that with 3 spotlights. Now these guys, they're going to be about the altitude of our ladder, somewhere roughly around there. So not quite as high as our main 2 spotlights. Again, for our main 2 spotlights, these guys right here, remember, they need to be pretty high for the simple fact that they need to be able to track that character all the way up to the top of the ladder, and then as he's doing his jump as well. We don't want him to suddenly disappear into darkness. That would not look too good. So with this light setup right here, we've got a total of 5 lights being used. Let's now go ahead and focus on the character himself. The character will have a very specific lighting rig that will allow us to set up some rim lights as well as a fill light illuminating the front, and then finally a bounce light at the bottom so that we can simulate light bouncing off of our stage and up onto the character himself. So we shall begin this quick discussion with... Need more room. A character. So here we are with our very happy character that's about to perform. Now, we'll start out with 2 rim lights in the back. Now, this guy, even though I've drawn him slightly off to the side, he's looking right at us, so keep that in mind. So here we are back here with 2 different rim lights. Now, if you've never worked with rim lights in the past, the goal of a rim light is to provide some illumination right there on the side, and this is fantastic for making an object become separated from things in the background.
Exactly, so here's where we're kind of breaking from necessarily real-world light, in quotes, and going towards more artistic light that's going to work for the camera angles that we're using, such that we can make sure that our character is distinguished from the background, and everything then gets added depth because of that, and everything is nice and clear. Whereas if we didn't have rim lights, we'd risk the edge of our character blending in with the background. Things would not be as crisp and clear, and artistically they wouldn't be as pleasant to look at.
Precisely. Now these lights will be called, I'm not going to write all of this down, but they'll be called Character Rim A and Character Rim B. Also appended to the name will be the word Shot 2, Shot 3, etc. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's go ahead and get our fill light in. So this is our light that's coming in and hitting from the front. So I'll draw it something like that right there. Now this light is going to be called something like Character Fill. And then once again, we'll have Shot 02, Shot 03, which we'll talk about in just a second. The final thing is up underneath our character, we're going to have a distant light. So don't let the drawing here confuse you. This light is coming straight on at the character. I just obviously did not want to draw it like this, but that is kind of what's going on. So now here we are with a distant light that resides up underneath the character. That's going to be a reddish color. And the idea is that we throw just a small amount of illumination up on the bottom of the character, once again, to help with separation and to simulate bounce light off of our staged floor.
Because you'll recall when we set up our stage, the stage was given a sort of a red hue in terms of the texture. That wood colour has got a red tint, so it would make sense for any light that is reflected off of that stage, as small and subtle as it's going to be, is going to have that red hue, which means if we have a red bounce light, we're going to simulate light hitting the stage, coming back and reflecting off as a slightly red hue light.
That's right. Now, I've mentioned that we're going to be adding names like shot 02, shot 03 into these names. Now, where does that come into play? What are we talking about? Because we're only looking at 3 lights here for the main lights around the character and then a distant light up underneath the character. Why are we going to have different names? And that's quite simple. Let's think about the way this light rig needs to work. A rim shot needs to provide illumination for the backside of an item in such a way that we just see an edge of light appearing on the side, like such, to help separate an object from its background. But what happens if our camera is tracking around in such a way, so we've got our character, right? The character is bouncing over and we're looking at him, but as we're looking, a rim shot from one angle might be providing the proper illumination from the backside of the character, but as our camera begins to swing around, now suddenly the rim shot, in this case rim B, would be providing more of a side light where it would look more like a key light for some reason that's being parented in. So how would we go about addressing the situation so that rim A and rim B always provide only rim illumination and then our fill from the front remains from the front? Well, first of all, we need to think about the perspective in which we're looking at our sphere, our character. In this case, I've drawn it in such a way that we're looking straight on. But at any time that we're looking at a character, we're looking through a camera. So if the lights were all positioned according to where the camera's at, then we could set something up where our rim lights would always be illuminating the backside and our fill light would always be illuminating the front. And this is very easy to do. What Steve's going to do is simply create a null, and he's going to set this null up so that it is going to travel along with our character. But then we'll make sure that the null is going to look at the camera, whatever camera is currently in play for the scene or the shot that we're rendering out. So let's go ahead and put that in here. Look at camera. Now, if we were to take our lights and parent our lights to this guy, then what are we going to have? Well, we're going to have a scenario where as this guy rotates around so that it's always looking at a camera, we'll have our lights rotating around as well. So if we set this up to begin with where everything's positioned just right for a camera, it's going to be quite convenient. The lights will always remain acting as the type of lights we've specified. Rim lights will remain rim lights because no matter how the character is positioned, again, we're more interested in the way our null is looking at the camera, and this will cause a rotation to occur, which technically is a translation in this case, of our lights. They're going to rotate around, which means they're actually moving through 3D space to continuously position themselves properly so that they provide the lighting that we're looking for. And that's great. But why are we going to have shot 2, shot 3, shot 4? Well, Steve's going to address the rendering issue coming up in the next section of videos, where we've got a lot of passes that we're going to be creating. And then in handling all of these passes, it would be very convenient if we had a script that did the work for us. So we're going to walk through the process of creating a Python script to handle out all of these rendered passes. In doing such, it would be very easy for us to say, all right, in this shot, we're only going to use this light, and this light down here. Notice how I've kind of left the distant light out as I've discussed the rig itself. The distant light doesn't need to reorientate or anything like that. It's a directional light, so it does not matter in this particular case. As long as it shows light reflecting up from the floor, that's all we're looking for. So when I say light rig, I'm really talking about these guys right here. So back to what I was getting at. So we're dealing with all of these rendered passes, and we're going to say with each rendered pass, these are the specific lights we're going to use for illuminating items in our scene. Run with the pass. And then, of course, rendering begins. Well, these lights right here are going to, there are positions based off of this null, and this null is based off of the camera that's being used for a particular shot. So somehow, rather by hand, we'd need to go in there and change it, or Steve would need to make modifications to a script to make a script go in there and change what camera the null is currently looking at. Instead of doing that, this only takes about, 3 seconds maybe?
Yeah, something like that. It's a very quick process.
What Steve's going to do is he's going to take the rig and just duplicate it off a couple of times so that we have 3 rigs, and then he'll set up, all right, null 1 in rig 1 is going to point at camera shot 2. The next null is going to point at shot 3, and the next null is going to be pointing at the camera for shot 4. That way, when Steve goes to specify the lights being used in his little script, he can simply say lights 1, 2, and 3 for this shot, lights 4, 5, and 6 for this shot, lights 7, 8, 9 for that shot.
It basically comes down to personal preference. We could have either gone in and made the script basically larger and able to address more situations by allowing our script to go in and change the parameter on the null. But it made sense that we had this nice simple script that allowed you to specify which lights you wanted included in a pass. We could just basically take that functionality and use it by simply duplicating off these lights. So that's the approach that I decided to go with.
Exactly. So here we are. I'm just going to put spotlight 1, spotlight 2, spotlight 3. So basically this is what this first rig looks like, but then Steve's able to come in and simply grab this entire thing and duplicate it off a couple more times, simply updating the null to point to the appropriate camera.
And the great thing is, because we're using that naming of underscore shot 2 when we initially name those lights, when we duplicate those nodes, they're going to get renamed by underscore shot 03, because Houdini automatically will bump up that trailing number by 1. We duplicate them again and they'll get renamed to underscore shot 04. So without doing anything, all the names are going to be updated to make things very clear which lights are for which shot.
Exactly. Okay, so we only have one thing left to deal with, and that is the audience. How are we going to go about lighting the audience? Well, for starters, we're going to place, let me find the best way that I want to draw this. First of all, I'll give you guys a cross section. So I'll give you something like that. So let's just say if we were to slice this out right here and take a look at a cross section, we would end up with something that looked like this. So down at the bottom, we're going to set up a distant light pointing upwards that is going to have a color of red. This will, once again, serve as sort of a bounce light to simulate light that's being bounced back from our stadium, from the stage. We've got a lot of red going on in the scene, so we want to make sure that some red is getting bounced around to all of our characters. And this will be called something like Bleachers Bounce. Then, of course, we need some sort of illumination from above, so we're going to use a distant light above pointing down. I'll just draw 2 arrows. This light will be blue, or a bluish color, blue-gray, if you will, and its name will be something like Bleacher's Top. I won't jot it down, but everyone's now heard it. And that's going to provide a very nice illumination once you go in there and you work with the parameters, of course, because now we've got all of this light being applied to our characters that's somewhat bouncing up, and then we've got all of this light that's coming from all over the place from above that's providing that grayish blue illumination. Now, we'd like to get some rim lighting in place for our characters, and this is where things really do get interesting. The rim lighting will help take all of our characters and kind of separate them away from the benches and the back of the stadium. It'll look really nice. But the question is, how do we go about getting this set up properly? Because if I was to put a light back over here to illuminate the sides of a character, well, what's going to happen with this light as it starts to get over into, depending on how wide of a cone we set up, we're going to start striking the side of characters' faces, and suddenly it's not going to look so much like a rim light when we start looking at characters that are not in the specific column that the light was set up for. It would be nice if we could go and do some light linking and say, look, all right, that light's only going to affect characters in this column only. Well, how do we need to go about doing that? Because at the moment, if you think about the stadium and the audience, it's just one object. What we're going to do is we're going to cache out all of our geometry. And by caching out the geometry, this means that basically every single frame is going to have a new geometry snapshot. This means that we won't have to have our network calculate the data for all of our characters bouncing up and down. So that's going to speed back up playback in our scene considerably, which is going to be nice. But also by breaking this up into just simple geometry snapshots, we can do some fancy stuff with our network to separate each of our columns into their own little groups that we can then address with very specific lights for illumination. So this is going to give us exactly what we're looking for. So let me go ahead and erase those, bring my brush back over. Now I don't unfortunately have a lot of room above, but I think everybody's going to get the idea real quick. What we're going to do is we're going to set some lights up like such, back behind where each of our columns come together. And this is going to work all the way around like such, which means we're also going to have one up here. Again, I just don't have the room. And then once we have broke up all of our columns, and then we're simply going to say, all right, this light is going to illuminate this crowd, and the other light that's off the screen up there is going to illuminate these guys. That's the only back rim lights that will illuminate this particular column. Then we'll just continue working our way around by saying this guy is going to illuminate this side and this guy will illuminate this side. In that particular case, this column is being only illuminated from the back side by these two lights only. And then we just simply continue that pattern all the way around. Those two guys will illuminate that column. These two guys over here are going to illuminate this column. And then finally that. That is going to provide us a lot of control over our rim lighting from a crowd that is distributed all the way around this arc. Okay? So with that in place, there's only one light left to discuss, and that is how are we going to give that real fine control over the illumination that's striking our characters dead on in the face when we begin with our opening shot. If you recall, we have a camera right here. Camera starts looking over there, and then the camera sweeps all the way around the audience, this big pan. So what are we going to do to provide control for us, as the artist in this case, over the light that's striking our characters right there in the front? Very simple. We'll add one more final light into the scene. This will be our audience ambience light. So this will simulate our ambience, and this is just going to be a distant light, so I'll go ahead and throw some arrows in there.
And the reason for choosing a distant light over an ambient light is the fact that the distant light still gives us some sense of direction, which means we're not going to get true flat shading on the front of our character. We will still get the sense that the character is a sphere, whereas we could have just thrown in an ambient light.
I am so much against ambient lights.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, the only way to effectively use ambient lights is if you're going to use very small numbers, very small numbers.
Yeah.
And even then, even though it is providing the illusion of light coming from all over, you still, even with small numbers, begin to flatten your scene.
Whereas we use a distant light, it's got a direction associated with it, which means that we're not going to flatten our characters, so we're still going to get a nice feeling of depth with the characters. But the added benefit of now we've got illumination on the front of the characters so we can actually see their faces, because if we think about it, we've got the rim lights and we've got that blue light coming down from the top. We may have a very subtle red light illuminating the face of the character, but that's not really going to illuminate the face of the character that greatly, so we needed to have an extra light for this first shot, because the audience is the focus of our shot. That first shot, the audience is the focus. We really need to see their faces and see their expressions.
So starting out, we'll simply drive parameters on this distant light with our camera, so that as our camera pans around, the light's going to rotate with the camera. And that way we'll make sure that we always have beams of light. And the nice thing is, since this is a distant light, in our peripheral vision, from what the camera picks up, there'll still be illumination over on the side as well. So as we sweep around, it won't look odd as if we had parented a spotlight to the camera and had the spotlight sweep around, where off on the side of our rendered images is like, hey, that's kind of dark over there. Then suddenly it's illuminated when we look at it. This way it's going to provide an even illumination that will travel with the camera, and that's going to give us a nice result. So let me go ahead and undo all of that. And looking over here at my notes, I think that's pretty much everything. So if you will allow me to do a quick recap, because there's been a lot that we've talked about here, we'll simply start things off with our main spotlights. Once again, this is a performance in some sort of performance hall or circus tent. We would like two real-world type spotlights pointing or shining down onto our character, and we begin with main spot 1 and main spot 2. Once again, leaving those light colors white so that in post-production we can tint them to whatever color looks best as far as we're concerned. Again, we get this overlapping illumination from the two spotlights right there. These two spotlights are raised high in the air because they need to track our character even as the character climbs the ladder and out onto the diving board and does his brilliant dive off. So those guys are high. The next thing we're going to do to provide some sort of illumination for the stage itself is to go in and place 3 spotlights about the level of our ladder, plus or minus just a little bit, just to give you a mental picture of how high it's going to be. We'll be using a red light, a blue light, and finally a green light, but we'll make sure that these 3 lights are overlapping in such a way that, out here you're looking at more of a white color, but again, coming around and taking a look at the side of the pool in this particular case, it's going to feel more green, and the side over here is a little more red, and we'll see that as our camera is starting to sweep around as he's tracking the character moving up. Also the ladder, one side of the ladder is a little more green, the other side's a little more red. So we're going to get some very nice variations of color in there between red, blue, and green. But once again, where everything's crossing here on the floor, it's going to be a whitish feel to it. From there, we moved our attention over to our character rig. The character rig is going to be comprised of 3 lights. The 4th light is irrelevant to the different lights that we will be using for the character rig. Let's just start with the 4th light. That's a distant light placed up underneath our stage that is illuminating upwards, simulating bounce light coming from the stage. So it's just putting a bit of a red hue on the bottom of the character, being picked up, light that's picking up color from the reddish colored wood. And then we're going to create 3 spots for the rig. Spot 1 and 2 are going to serve as rim lights, providing, once again, just a little bit of illumination on the side of our character, allowing us to break the character out from the background. It's very nice looking. And then we'll use a spotlight for the front of the character as a fill light, just so that we have illumination on the front of the character. Now, we would like for this rig to make sure that it swivels around the character in such a way that whatever camera is currently looking at the character, those lights are always positioned properly. Fill light dead on, and our 2 rim lights split off from the back, giving us our 2 rimmed illuminations on the character itself. And the way we're going to pull this off is by putting a knoll into the scene. We'll parent the 3 lights to a knoll, and we'll make sure that the knoll is looking at the camera. Now, we have 3 different cameras where this light rig is going to be quite important. Obviously, shot 1 has nothing to do with the character, so there's no reason to have a knoll and rig for shot 1. It's shot 2 where everything comes to life. So we'll start this guy off at shot 2. So once again, all of our naming will have shot 02, 03, and 04 at the very end. But to make things easier for when we get over to breaking everything down into a series of render passes, we will simply duplicate this hierarchy off. So we've taken our 2 rims and our fill, we've parented them to the knoll, we've told the knoll to look at the current camera, or the current camera responsible for picking up that shot. We duplicate this entire thing off 2 more times, and we set knoll 2 to point to the camera in shot 3, and knoll 3 to point to the camera in shot 4. Whew, that's confusing. And then we know that at render time, if the render pass goes in there and says, all right, we're currently dealing with shot 2, so these are going to be the 3 lights that we're going to use, well, we know that the knoll is going to be responding correctly to the camera that we're rendering through, and that's the nice thing we're looking for. And then when we move over to render out shot 3, we know that our spotlights 4, 5, and 6 are all being controlled by a knoll that is being influenced by, once again, the camera we're looking through, camera 3 for shot 3. So that's a quick look at that. Finally, moving over to our audience and stadium, we'll handle this with just a few lights. Again, side view over here, a distance light giving us a red illumination going up to simulate some bounce light. Again, very subtle. It's just bounce light. And then coming from above, another distant light that's giving us a bluish gray fill on all of our characters so that we don't end up with the tops of their heads being all black. That would not be good. We know that spot on, or straight on if you will, the way that we're getting the illumination on our characters is through a distant light that is being controlled by the camera there at the center, our shot 01 camera. So that as shot 01 pans around the audience, that distant light will follow along with us, giving us kind of a headlight type effect as if we had mounted headlights onto our camera. So that provides our front illumination. We'll be leaving the color on that light white so that we can control that in post. And then finally, we thought it would be really nice to have rim lighting on our audience. And we saw that the way we would go about doing that is by putting the spotlights back behind our stadium, right at the division point for each of our columns. But the interesting problem that we had was that we needed to isolate geometry and lights, because once again, this guy way over here, casting light all the way over here, not a good thing. We don't want a rim light providing frontal light to another character. And so the way we're going to do this is to take our geometry and render it out, render our geometry out. Basically, we're going to break our geometry out so that we're no longer dealing with the large audience asset. We now have very specific geometry that we can bring back in and say, all right, that guy is going to be only controlled by that spotlight and this spotlight over here. So even though it's going to look the same, two things are going to happen. One, we can use light linking to control what lights will strike it, which is going to work perfect for us with all of our back rim lights. And second, we're going to get much quicker feedback in our viewport because we no longer have to pump a bunch of data through the bleachers asset. Steve, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, I'd really quickly like to talk about shadows.
Okay, sounds good.
Very, very quickly. The lights that are going to have shadows are going to be our main spotlights, our secondary spotlights, and the top light for the audience. And why those lights and none of the other lights? Well, it makes sense for our main spotlights to cast shadows because they're the key lights for our scene. They are the most important lights. The secondary spotlights, they're also, if they were to cast shadows, they're going to give us some interesting shadows cast with the pool and the ladder. So they're going to add to the artistic effect of seeing all these shadows coming from different directions on our stage. Things like the character rig, however, and the rim lights on the audience, it doesn't make sense for those to have shadows because they're artistic lights to help bring out certain areas of the character and not so much physical lights that exist in our scene.
Right.
Now, I did want to add the shadows on our top light for the audience, that blue directional light for the audience, because of the fact that that gives us the ability to basically make sure that the audience look like they're sitting on the benches, because we're going to get shadows cast underneath each of the audience members. So that's why our main spots, our secondary spots, and that top-down light will have shadows and all the other lights will not.
Okay, excellent.
Cool.
Outside of that,
nothing else I'd like to add, no.
All right, fantastic. Well, over the next few videos, we will be putting this together. And with that, that is going to wrap up this whiteboarding lesson. Thanks a lot.